it is now several years, I began my seminary studies at Meadville Lombard, and one of the first classes that I took was a course in Unitarian Universalist history. And we've been through many of the historical issues in various sermons and classes here. But one of the things that the person teaching that class, David Bumbaugh, wanted us to be exposed to was the broader scope of those who have contributed to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. And in particular, people whose contributions are not often acknowledged, particularly women, people of color, and others. And so we were each assigned a particular individual to read about and then do a presentation to the class. I happened to do mine on a woman by the name of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was an African-American abolitionist prior to the Civil War. But one of the other people that they talked about in the class was May Sarton, who was a poet and with Unitarian leanings, though in fact she never actually signed the book in any Unitarian church, which is a problem we constantly have. So what I thought I would be doing today is we would talk a bit about May Sarton, but the only way to really get the feeling of a poet or an author of any kind is to hear their writing. And so much of what we're going to be doing this morning are going to be opportunities for various members of the congregation to read poetry to which they've been assigned. Now, for those of you who are going to be reading, I will from time to time reference the name of the work that you will be reading from. Would invite you to come up here. I'll sit over on the side here. Please come up and read your poem. And please, as Josh encouraged us to do yesterday, project. May Sarton was born on May 3rd of 1912 in a place called Wandelgem, Belgium. She was an only child. Her father was an academic, and they had to flee Belgium at the beginning of World War I, because those of you that know your World War I history, that was where the major German assault went through. And so they initially went to England and eventually ended up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her father, George Sarton, was a historian of science. He taught at Harvard University. His mother was a designer of furniture and fabric in Belgium, but she became a housewife and a mom raising her daughter when they moved to the United States. She, in one of her early writings, from a piece called A World of Light, Portraits and Celebrations, May writes a little bit about her life, and I'm going to just read a brief portion of this. During the first 2 years of my life in the small heaven of our house in Wandelgem, Belgium, I was snatched away from my mother for weeks at a time because of her illnesses, sent to stay with friends, or for one period of time, more than a month, given into the care of a dear friend who came to Wandelgem to look after me. When I was 2, we were driven out by the war, and again I was sent to cousins in England while my mother and father tried to find means of livelihood in London. What all these uprootings did, I think, was to make the baby and the small child learn to put out roots very quickly for survival. I became passionately attached to whomever took care of me, and perhaps this explains what someone called my emotional facility when I was grown up. We were not able to settle anywhere for the first 6 years of my life. Then at last we reached Cambridge, Massachusetts, where my parents stayed for good, which became home. Even so, we moved every 7 years when my father had a sabbatical and we all went to Europe, furniture being put in storage in a new apartment found in our return. It is not surprising then that I've always felt nostalgia for families rooted in one place and the routines of family life. My parents were remarkable since I was an only child, and always leaving me free to do what I wanted and to be myself. My mother's theory of education was to be quite severe when I was an infant and until I was about 10 years old, and then to give me almost absolute freedom of choice. As a child, I left the house for Shady Hill School at about 7 every morning on my bicycle and came home often after dark. No one ever said, "Don't climb that tree, you might fall." She goes on to write, my father had never been a father in the usual sense. He could not, absorbed as he was almost totally in his work, really pay attention. And when I was small, I learned to be very silent. for he worked at home and the slightest noise interrupted his concentrations. So at an early age, I witnessed the fact that work was of the first importance and that it was justified rather in human behavior. I don't know when I began to be aware of the rifts in the marriage, but it certainly was before I was 10. Following her high school, high school years, she had received a possible scholarship to Vassar, which her father and mother, both, particularly her father being an academic, really wanted her to take up. But she was more interested in the theater and in the arts. And so she declined to go to Vassar, much to her parents' consternation, and ended up instead becoming apprenticed in the theater. And I don't know if I can pronounce the name of the person or not, but it was a Madame Laguienne, which had a civic repertory theater in New York. And later, after that, she became a director, but she also began writing. And one of the first poems, in one of the first books of poetry that she wrote, was a piece called Strangers. And somebody, I believe, has Strangers. Please come on up.
Strangers. There have been two strangers who met within a wood and looked once at each other where they stood. And there have been two strangers who met among the heather and did not look at all, but lay down together. And there have been two strangers who met one April day and looked long at each other and went on their way.
According to the biographical excerpt in the Dictionary of Unitarian Universalist Biography, at the age of 10, May was introduced to the Unitarian Church by her neighborhood friend Barbara Runkle, whose family attended the First Parish in Cambridge. May was impressed by the minister Samuel McCord Crothers, whose sermons she thought full of quiet wisdom. One sermon in particular she recalled in her memoir At 70, which was written in 1984, which said, "This sermon made a great impression on me and really marked me for life. I can hear him saying, 'Go into the inner chamber of your soul and shut the door.' The slight pause after soul did it. A revelation to the child who heard it and who has never forgotten it." So she had an early introduction to Unitarianism, but in fact, she never really really joined a Unitarian church. As it says here in this excerpt that as an adult, Sarton did not become a member of any Unitarian church, nor did she regularly attend religious services. She believed, however, that the Unitarian Universalists helped her get over the hump from small poetry audiences to larger engagements. In 1972, at the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly, Richard Henry, a minister from Denver, presented a special service based on Sarton's work, Composing a Life, to an audience of 500. Following this event, the other larger audiences gathered at various Unitarian Universalist churches to hear Sarton speak. In 1976, Sarton was invited to lecture at the Unitarian Universalist Thomas Starr King School of Religious Leadership, now Starr King Seminary, from which she received an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters. And in 1982, she delivered the Ware Lecture, which for any of you who've not been to General Assembly is one of the major presentations. It's quite an honor. People like Martin Luther King and Dag Hammarskjöld have also delivered the Ware Lecture. She did a Ware Lecture called The Values We Keep, and President Eugene Pickett of the UUA at that time introduced her as our poet. So even though she never was a member, like many others, we have claimed her as ours because she sympathized with our views and was provided inspiration to our folks. I would invite the reader of the poet of prayer, please come up.
of prayer. Straining the dark for some answer, calling the strange dancer with our formal prayers. Hope for a private sign, a secret world of grace. We never meet your face. Prince of the imagination, not to our prayers have you been merciful. Always the human faces. Open their eyes behind our lids, and all our questions become humane questions. So when we seek, we do not find you, and offer you no suggestions. But in that hour least expected, when we are most ourselves and not deflected, even by remembrance of your name, we stream down the paths of grace. Hour of the poem, or that hour when two people war to the bone and meet each other's skeleton. Here desire is a tremendous flower. Petals have steel in their growing, balance and power as the pillar that supports the arched leaves of stone. It is a mistake, perhaps, to believe that religion concerns you at all, that it is our own invention, longing for formal acceptance to a formal invitation. But yours to be the anarchist, the thrust of growth, and to be present only in prayer that is creation, in the life that is lived, love planted deeper than emotion, pure idea that cannot break apart, creator of children or the work of art. It's May Sarton of prayer.
But in spite of her Unitarian leanings, May Sarton could also be critical of Unitarians. She writes, the biographical dictionary writes, in spite of these positive associations, Sarton could be critical of Unitarians. I find them a little sentimental, she wrote in a letter in 1978. Perhaps the emphasis is almost entirely on human relations. When she read her religious poems at the Unitarian Church in Brattleboro, Vermont, she was not satisfied with the reception. I suppose it went all right, she recorded in a Journal of Solitude, but I felt that the kind, intelligent people gathered in the big room looking out on pine trees did not really want to think about God, his absence, or his presence. Both were too frightening. Goes on to say that if Sarton can be labeled at all, she was a humanist. She told Michael Finley, "We're humanists, you see. The extreme right considers us devils, and that's something else in our favor." Sarton was less interested in organized religion than in something she saw as broader, the spirit or perhaps humanity. Terms such as God, Christ, heaven, and hell were used only metaphorically in her writing, yet a sense of the transcendent animated her work. In a Journal of Solitude she wrote, "There's really only one possible prayer. Give me to do everything I do in the day with a sense of the sacredness of life. Give me to be in your presence, God, even though I know it only as absence." May Sarton was also a lesbian, and according to one of the writers, that it was her relationships with women that was her muse when it came to writing poetry. The women Sarton loved, they write, were the catalyst for her poetry. In the presence of the muse and the creative act of writing poetry, Sarton found a spirituality. In her June 1974 article, The Practice of Two Crafts for the Christian Science Monitor, Sarton says perhaps every true poem is a dialogue with God, and when we're able to write a poem, we become for a few hours a part of creation herself. While she was younger, she traveled quite a bit, and it reads that on one of these trips to Santa Fe, New Mexico, Sarton met Judith Matlack, the woman with whom she would share her life for many years, and with whom she found the greatest stability and companionship. In spite of early love affairs with men, it was with women Sarton found her muse. As in the journal at 70, she wrote, "Judy was the precious only love with whom I lived for years, the only one. There may have been other great loves in my life, but only Judy gave me a home and made me know what home was to be." And it was for Judy and their life together that Sarton wrote the poem "A Light Left On," which appeared in the volume Land of Silence. So as a light left on.
A light left on. In the evening we came back into our yellow room, for a moment taken aback to find the light left on, falling on silent flowers, table, book, empty chair, while we had gone elsewhere, had been away for hours. When we came home together, we found the inside weather, all of our love unended, and quiet life we demanded. And we gave in a look at yellow walls and an open book. The deepest world we share and do not talk about, but have to have, was there, and by that light found out.
One of the themes in the Joys and Concerns this morning was the theme of the passage of time and the passage of birthdays. And so as May Sarton got older, she also reflected on this particular passages of life. And so she wrote a journal, a memoir, at 70. I believe that Sylvia has that portion.
Such a peaceful, windless morning here for my 70th birthday. The sea is pale blue, and although the field is still brown, it is dotted with daffodils at last. What is it like to be 70? If someone else had lived so long and could remember things 60 years ago with great clarity, she would seem very old to me. But I do not feel old at all, not as much a survivor as a person still on her way. I suppose real old age begins when one looks backward rather than forward. But I look forward with joy to the years ahead, and especially to the surprises that any day may bring. In the middle of the night, things well up from the past that are not always cause for rejoicing. The unsolved, the painful encounters, the mistakes, the reasons for shame or woe. But all, good or bad, painful or delightful, weave themselves into a rich tapestry, and all give me food for thought, food to grow on. In the course of a poetry reading at Hartford College, I said, "This is the best time of my life. I love being old." At that point, a voice from the audience asked loudly, "Why is it good to be old?" I answered spontaneously and a little on the defensive, for I sensed incredulity in the questioner. "Because I am more myself than I have ever been. There is less conflict. I am happier, more balanced, and," I heard myself say rather aggressively, "more powerful." I felt it was rather an odd word, powerful, but I think it is true. It might have been more accurate to say, I am better able to use my powers. I am surer of what life is all about, have less self-doubt. We are never done with thinking about our parents, I suppose, and come to know them better long after they are dead than we ever did when they were alive. I realize that 70 must seem extremely old to my young friends, but I actually feel much younger than I did when I wrote The House by the Sea 6 years ago, and younger than I did in Nelson when I wrote the poem Gestalt at 60. Those previews of old age were not entirely accurate, I'm discovering. And that, as far as I can see, is because I live more completely in the moment of these days, am not as anxious about the future, am far more detached from the areas of pain, the loss of love, the struggle to get work completed, the fear of death. I have less guilt because there is less anger. Perhaps before I die, I shall make peace with my Father and be able to heal the wound.
Another piece that she wrote on growing old was a poem, Old Lovers at the Ballet.
In the dark theatre, lovers sit watching the supple dancers weave a fugue, motion and music melded. There on the stage below, brilliantly lit, no dancer stumbles or may grieve. Their very smiles are disciplined and moulded. And in the dark, old lovers feel dismay, watching the ardent bodies leap and freeze, thinking how age has changed them and has mocked. Once they were light and bold in lissome play, limber as willows that could bend with ease. But as they watch, a vision is unlocked. Imagination springs the trap of youth. And in the darkness, motionless as they stare, old lovers reach new wonders and new answers, as in the mind they leap to catch the truth. For young, the soul was awkward, unaware, that claps its hands now with the supple dancers. And in the flesh, those dancers cannot spare what the old lovers have had time to learn, that the soul is a live and serene athlete that deepens touch upon the darkening air. It is not energy, but light they burn, the radiant powers of the Paraclete.
One of the themes that recurs as one reads about May Sarton is her relationship with her father, and her kind of, as indicated in one of the earlier pieces, her efforts to come to terms with her father prior to his death. One of her poems after his death was called A Celebration for George Sarton, which reflects some of the coming to terms that she did.
A celebration for George Sarton. I never saw my father old. I never saw my father cold. His stride staccato, vital. His talk struck from pure metal. Simple as gold and all his learning, only to light a passion's burning. So beaming like a lesser god, he bounced upon the earth he trod. And people marveled on the street at this stout man's impetuous feet. Loved donkeys, children, awkward ducks. Loved to retell old simple jokes. Lived in a world of innocence where loneliness could be intense. Wrote letters until very late. Found comfort in an orange cat. Rufus and George exchanged no word. But while George worked, his Rufus purred. And neighbors looked up at his light, warmed by the scholar working late. I never saw my father passive. He was electrically massive. He never hurried, so he said, and yet a fire burned in his head. He worked as poets work, for love, and gathered in a world alive, while black and white above his door spoke mystery, the avatar An Arabic inscription flowed like singing in the name of God. And when he died so swift, his death was like a final gift. He went out when the tide was full, still undiminished, bountiful, the scholar and the gentle soul, the passion and the life were whole. And now death's wake is only praise, as when a neighbor writes and says, I did not know your father, but his light was there. I miss the light.
I invite you to, if you take your hymnals out and go to the reading number 718 in the back of the hymnal. There are 3 readings by May Sarton that are contained in our hymnal, and this is one that is often used at memorial services and funerals. And so what I would like to do is I would like to read the regular type if you would read responsively the italics. Did someone say that there would be an end?
An end, oh, an end to love and mourning.
What has been once so interwoven cannot be raveled, nor the gift ungiven.
Now dead move through all of us, still glowing.
Mother and child, lover and lover, mated are wound and bound together and in flowing.
What has been plaited cannot be unplaited. Only the strands grow richer with each loss.
As memory makes kings and queens of us,
Dark into light, light into darkness, sin. When all the birds have flown to some real haven.
we who find shelter in the warmth within, listen and feel new cherished, new forgiven.
As the lost human voices speak through us and blend our complex love, our mourning without end.
May Sarton died on July 16, 1995. She left an impressive legacy of over 50 books, including novels, poetry, memoirs, and journals. Her appeal, according to this writer, lay in her ability to sacramentalize the ordinary by probing everyday subjects such as flowers, gardens, animals, changing sunlight, and personal relationship in order to find deeper and universal truths. She examined such themes as the need for solitude, the role of the muse in the act of poetic creativity, and the role of the female artist in society. There's much more that we could read and share today, but our times, as often, are limited. So I invite you, if this has struck an interest at all, to find some time to explore further the work of May Sarton. I'll just take a few minutes to see what thoughts any of you might have.